I do. It's
Hello,
okay if it's
everyone. Today we're doing something special. David Pepper is going to talk about a special interest of his, the psychedelics and the history and the medical uses and the uses in death and dying. So you all know David. So without further ado, I'm going to try to share the screen and let,
John,
yeah,
can I ask for a moment?
yes.
I don't think we should proceed without acknowledging what a wonderful presentation you had in Martinez on Monday or Sunday
Well,
at the Martins Veterans Hall. It was absolutely incredible. And he got a rounding ovation.
yeah, well,
And
thank you. And thank you, Carol, for
Here, I agree with you. That was wonderful.
yeah, well, thank you both for attending. It was nice to have study group support there. That was great. Okay, so we're recording, mind you. So I'm going to share a screen, and David is going to give his talk. So take it away, David.
Okay, go back 2 slides, John. There we go. Perfect. Well, thanks, John. As John mentioned, I'm worked with John in the county as family physician, and then during COVID retired and went back to school in psychedelics, which is a long interest of mine, and specifically around helping people. I think people know Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, or certainly heard of it, but the applications to kind of living better and dying better is really where I hope to focus this. So a little bit of an overview, just, a little bit about control, a couple stories, including historical stories of where psychedelics were first introduced in various cultures, a little bit about how they work, and then what they may be helpful for. So feel free to interrupt. So the next slide is meant as a prompt question for, how many of you have done psychoactive substances this month? And, if you didn't count caffeine or alcohol, it would be a little more limited, but do people know what this plant is?
Do you need it forward? Don't
No, common hop. This is hop. What is hop used for?
beer.
Here,
Beer making. So interesting. And what family does it belong to? If you look up in the top left.
Oh, cannabis, huh?
The
Yeah, so
cannabis
it's the only other member of the Cannabinaceae family other than cannabis, marijuana, which people don't realize. And we tend to think of beer as just being alcohol, but and I'm actually not aware of any psychoactive substances in it, but it is interesting that it comes from the Cannabinaceae family. Okay, next slide, John, please. And so, a little bit about, I mentioned Michael Pollan's book, what, How to Change Your Mind. And, we have this sense of control, and particularly as physicians, but as people living on the western edge of this culture, we like to think we're in control of things. And, in the inner circle here is things you can control. And in the outer is things you really can't control. And what happens to you, what happens around you, what other people think, how others take care of themselves, the opinions of others are all really out of our control. And we like to think we're in control. We drive our cars, we have our houses, and sometimes events happen that take us out of that control sphere. And usually getting sick, and particularly facing an end of life diagnosis, is one of those things that people can't always control. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And the other one, how I handle challenges, this green at the base. That's, we like to think we're in control, but a lot of times things come up and we're actually not as in control as we might think. So, okay, next slide, John.
Hello, Homer. We missed you yesterday.
Yeah, I saw the report. Sounds like a great trip. I'm gonna reread that chapter about hippies.
Okay.
And I do remember my mother, the
He's
axe
on
murderer.
the
I married an axe murderer.
He's doing
Okay.
presentation.
Sorry for the interruption.
No worries. Just we were talking a little bit about what we're in control of and what we're not in control of, and just mentioned how we handle change and challenges is one of the things we think we're in control of, but it's not always the case. If you think about when things happen to you, we sometimes are better and sometimes not as good at as accepting the challenges that are thrown at us. Okay, next slide, John. So this is from the Judy Chicago exhibit that was at the De Young. She had a whole thing about dying and death. And we're going to talk, one of the subtexts is about being in control of our own death and dying, and how psychedelics might help us fathom and get accustomed, or maybe even a little friendlier with the dying process. But here's this question: Will I be contorted in the throes of death? And a related question is, will I be in control? Because it's not always the case. Next slide, John. And here's another Judy Chicago. How will I die? And will I die embracing the light? Because we have that the near-death experiences, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to ketamine, because in fact many people's near-death experiences may be occasioned by ketamine and it's used for anesthesia. But there's that sense of the light at the end of the tunnel, and there's I think a hope that everybody will be calm and peaceful, and we'll sort of see the light, and we're just going to gently drift into it and be very, very calm. Okay, next slide. So this is a little bit of a personal story. This is my father on the right half of the screen, and I. This is maybe 10 years ago. He died about 2 years ago. And of note, he was an educated man, had his doctorate, and we had a very close relationship. And part of the reason I stopped being a full-time physician was to help care for him in the last year of his life. And he was a professor at San Francisco State. He was pretty copacetic with marijuana. Never really did much else, but towards the end of his life, he'd had back surgeries, and I wouldn't say he got hooked on opiates, but it certainly became a regular part of his life that he would take after one of the surgeries, they got him on oxycodone, and then he was finally on Tylenols with codeine, but with constipation and kind of a dulling. And at some point I said, hey, Dad, have you thought about, a little bit cannabis? And we started this talking about how cannabis is widely used. It's now legal in 37 states in the United States. And in fact, he did begin using cannabis through a vape pen, and would get up in the morning, have a little bit. It would help ease his mind, and then around lunch he'd have another, just one hit, and then around dinner one more, and then one before bedtime, and was able to get off the narcotics quite successfully. And those of you who've tried, we're not going to do a raise your hand, but there are something like 15 million people using cannabis every day now. And it's not necessarily something that you sit in the corner and eat popcorn and watch movies for. People use it for other things, but certainly helped my father in that. So that's sort of the introduction. And cannabis is a mild psychedelic. And one of the teachings around psychedelics is a formulation that Timothy Leary came up with, which is set and setting. So it's quite important where you are, who you're with, and what your intention is as you're using substances. And sometimes it's a drink at night just to relax yourself, and sometimes it's going to a party and socially. We all know and have probably dealt with friends or family who got derailed and got into the addictive side of alcohol. Cannabis, mildly. We'll talk a little bit about ketamine, which can be addictive, but most of the true psychedelics, mushrooms and LSD included, have very, very low addiction rates. People are not doing a dose of psilocybin and then rushing out to do it next week. It's quite a journey. It's quite an experience, and one that people like to reflect on for weeks to months, and for many people, maybe a one-time experience. Next slide. So this is just the psychedelic experience, and we'll talk a little bit about. But if again, if we were in a bigger audience, I might ask how many people have had a true psychedelic experience. But I'll get to that in a little bit about what a psychedelic experience is and how you can actually even talk about it, because it's quite difficult if you've never been on one to equate the experience with something. Next slide. The closest, and people talk, and I have a slide later where I talk about how people measure a psychedelic experience. But one of the better measures, is a sense of awe. And so here, this is tunnel view of Yosemite after a winter storm. Being in nature in a setting like this is, to me, one of the greatest awe experiences. And there certainly is a component of psychedelics that brings about that sense of awe. And so we'll talk about that. All right, next slide. So I want to back up 1,000 years. This is a sarcophagus that sits in the in Boston's what's her name? The
Elizabeth Gardner.
Thank you, Isabella Stewart Gardner's museum. She was quite a collector, and you'll notice along the top edge of the sarcophagus are grapes. Around the base are the cherubs, and this is around the time of Christ, or a little bit before, but it goes, in fact, much farther back. There's a whole field of what's called archaeochemistry that is now scraping the inside of the chalices that were used for drinking wine, and there's a sacred, mysterious temple in Elysius, it's called the Elysian Mysteries, which existed from 1600 BC to 400 AD. So for about 2,000 years. And they're the mysteries because we don't know what happened there exactly. What we do know from the archaeochemistry is that it was a mixture of probably a beer and a wine, kind of a mead mix, but they were also using rye, specifically fermented rye, which is the source for LSD. So the ergot alkaloids have been found, and for this 2,000-year period, the ceremonies were held by the priestesses of Demeter and Persephone, and were for men around the age of 50. And they would journey about 8 miles to the northwest of Athens, and it was a once-in-a-lifetime journey. They would spend about a week. We visited one of these temples in Pergamon, and you entered the temple through a dark tunnel that had cascading water, little teeny water rivulets on either side. The rotunda it was in was covered and dark. It was thought to have been lit by flames with incense. People were not allowed in if they were mentally ill, or if they were pregnant, or in fact, if they were women. But it's thought that the ceremony that was brought to bear for that period of time involved psychedelics. We don't know exactly what that meant. We don't know exactly how it was used, but it was thought to be some sort of a life passage, or like a rite of passage. That's 2,000 years ago, or from 1500, 1600 to 20 to 3,500 years ago. In fact, there's a history going farther back on the archaeochemistry. If you go to Turkey, there are chalices and goblets there that trace back 5,700 years. Specifically, psilocybin is found on 180 different kinds of mushrooms, which are on every continent except for Antarctica. And there have been several kind of renaissances of psychedelics, but if we consider the first one to be 1600 BC for those 2,000 years, we fast forward from that one to around the 1500s in Europe, and in fact in this country it was in Salem, Massachusetts, where the witches were brought up. I do want to backtrack just for a second, though, because in the period around 0 AD, the roots of Christianity were being formed. And there is a slightly controversial but fairly well-established story that the crypts under the streets of Rome were actually the source of early Christianity, and that psychedelics were used in that. And if one interprets many of the stories, even in Judaism, going back, the burning bush of Moses, the chariots of fire of Ezekiel, one can have a different interpretation of religion and the origins of religion if one ventures to think about that. So a couple thousand years ago, probably involved in the birth of Christianity, there was the first wave. Around 400, when Eliseus falls, there's a coincidental rise in Christianity. The first Christian Roman in Constantinople moves to take over what we now know as Istanbul, but takes over Constantinople, I think about 376 AD. And around the same time, the Christian church moves to not only stamp out psychedelics, but in fact, stamp out Judaism, and Islam wasn't even there yet. But there is a history then going forward through 1000 AD, when the Holy Roman Crusades again rampaged across Europe. 1300, they again rampaged. And then I mentioned it in the 1500s. So in the 1500s and 1600s, and in fact, forward probably into the 1900s almost, the concept of the witch emerged. And it's well known from the archaeochemistry of Salem that the witch's brew, which we think of it in a cauldron, was an alcoholic mix. It certainly involved 4 mildly psychedelic plants, but included Jimson weed and henbane. So 2 things that clearly caused alterations in your mental status. And in fact, the witch's broom was used as a insertion device, either rectally or vaginally, for insertion of a paste that would yield psychedelic results. Some of these chemicals are not. Oh, you fast forward there, John, but we'll get to that. But and in fact, one of the themes that comes up is that the suppression of psychedelics, first by the Christian Church, then in the 1700s, and then again we'll talk about in the 70s, have all been by white men in power, where it's reasonable to suppose that it was a threat to the status quo and the way the power was given. Okay, come forward again now to that slide. So this is Sasha Shogren on the left, who actually lived in Lafayette, about a little over a mile from the school there, around the corner from 2 of our colleagues. And Sasha was a chemist. He worked for a large chemical company. People may remember or know the history that in the early 60s, actually starting around 56, when Abby Hoffman first synthesized LSD and figured out the chemical derivative of it, again, LSD being a derivative of the ergot alkaloids, that the chemists became interested. And in fact, Sandoz sent out, I believe, 40,000 doses of LSD, mostly to psychiatrists and psychologists, because it was thought to be a very interesting drug to help people examine their psyches. It was used by the CIA and FBI. It was thought they could use it as a truth serum. It was thought to be a psychomimetic for a psychotic behavior. Not quite true, but widely used in the 60s and 70s. And while MDMA is not a psychedelic, it was a drug that was widely used in couples therapy. And Sasha Shogren resynthesized it. He called it a low calorie martini, but it opened up a person to both other people and their inner self. And some people say it's a psychoplastogen. It allows you to have less judgment about yourself. It's technically classed as an empathogen, which means it allows you to open your heart. And again, without asking people who've done it, it's my wife says at one point I actually had a little bit of empathy for Donald Trump for all the abuse he had been through. But it was widely used for people in the 60s and early 70s to have understanding and compassion, both for, say, their spouse and the way they've been treated, but for themselves and for their parents. So they might have a better understanding of why their father was a very pushy, aggressive person, or why their mother was a distant alcoholic. And in that compassion, the opportunity to change your own mind around how you view your upbringing with a lens towards more compassion for the roots of where you came from, but also for your own judgments of yourself. MDMA now is being used in combination with some of the psychedelics, so you can open someone's heart a bit and then give them a psychedelic experience. We'll talk a little bit more about psychedelics here going forward. But that's kind of the history. And then, of course, famously Nixon, there was one nurse who jumped out of a window, and there was a lot of backlash against marijuana because it was being used by the hippies who were anti-war, and Nixon wanted war. And there's a whole story there about how and why it was shut down over politics, but it was shut down by white men, basically. And we are in the fourth Renaissance now. We'll get to that a little bit, but I think it's hard to open the paper on any given week without hearing something about psychedelics and the resurgence and the interest in them. I mentioned 37 states have legalized cannabis. MDMA will likely be legalized. The studies around it, particularly with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, are phenomenal. Even back in the 60s and 70s, it was used widely for alcohol addiction, very successfully, but was shut down, and many people feel it was quite a travesty. So there's a lot of concern now about the reopening of it, and those involved want it to be done well, want it to be done mindfully, and want to avoid as much as we can of the kind of paranoia. That paranoia came out last week or the week before, when people may remember the story of the pilot who did psilocybin and then threatened the whole plane. That's really only a small piece of the story. He had a history of deep depression. He'd been awake for 40 hours, and he was in fact not the pilot of the plane. He was sitting near the pilot. But the story we heard was, mushrooms almost caused 86 people to die, and he's being thrown in jail for that. But I would imagine some of the other story is he was deeply depressed and seeking some sort of relief from that. That is a story that is, I think, threatening to the pharmaceutical industry. We'll talk about that a little bit more because they don't really have a way to make money off it. They make a lot of money off antidepressants currently. This is a good place to just stop and see if people have questions, because I want to move a little bit forward into the chemistry and more current. So any questions about the history of psychedelics or the role they've had?
So one comment, David. So you talked about LSD being released in the CIA. The CIA ran some experiments, the truth serum that you mentioned, and asked for volunteers at the VA hospitals. And the Stanford VA hospital was, of course, they got a lot of volunteers, and one of them was a wrestler that was headed for the Olympics, and but he was just waiting for a year, and he had time on his hands, and his name was Ken Kesey. So there you go.
Yeah, there were a number of people. We're going to talk about psilocybin, but Cary Grant did psilocybin somewhat famously. There were people who were, it was much more public. Thank you, John, for the story about Ken Kesey. Yeah, and people I think know Ken Kesey, electric Kool-Aid acid test. And that story is often thought of now because people don't want things to go off the rails quite like they did then. When you want to tune in, drop in, tune out, whatever, it was an anti-war sentiment that was spread.
Well,
right.
And we talked about this. Our guide yesterday, who's written this wonderful book, the Cool Gray City of Love, and he has a wonderful chapter, which I hope I sent to you, Homer, about the '60s and the Summer of Love. Timothy Leary was a big player, as you've mentioned.
Yeah. Okay, next slide. So I'm not going to go in super deep, except to say that this is top picture is the SSRIs, so selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and that is Prozac and Paxil and many of the common antidepressants. And in fact, the bottom slide is psilocybin. They work via a very similar mechanism. They work via serotonin. Psilocybin is sort of a higher spike, and it gives us a much more of a sudden, heavy dose, but they do both work similarly. And in fact, many of the studies are now showing psilocybin having long-term effects on depression. It's being widely investigated for that use. Next slide. Again, not going to go into this except to say that the 5-HT, which is 5-hydroxytryptamine or serotonin, and this is a 2A receptor, is a very complex mechanism that impacts a number of intracellular processes. The chemists are working the details out. There's almost two ends of the spectrum. There's the chemical end when they're looking at very, very detailed little things. And then there's the other end, which is really the psychological effects. And so I'm not really going to go into the chemical process, except to say that the classic 5-HT2A receptors are psilocybin and LSD, or signalers, and ketamine, which I'll mention just because it's so popular, and it is not and does not appear to work only by this. It works by a separate glutamate receptor, but there may be some common final pathways. Okay, next slide. So this is the psychedelic state, and I'm going to let you just read these descriptors. There is a mystical a questionnaire that tries to get to this, but heightened sense of salience and significance, oceanic boundlessness, perceptions unprejudiced by prior expectations. Yeah, not totally true, but unconscious material with new meaning, new perspectives. One's will held by a higher power, loss of ego boundaries, rigid definition of self. The attention is no longer coupled or bound to the way you think you have to be. We'll talk about this a little more going forward. But new kind of objectivity, sense of sacredness, a slowing of time, drop in your defense mechanisms, new forms of empathy for yourself and others, self not constrained by time and space, relief of alienation, and access to deep collective transpersonal unconsciousness. So people often talk about having a mystical event, and that this is some of the words that are used to describe it. Next slide, John. Can I come back to nature? And if you looked at the slide and you were to try to describe this to a blind person, you can think about the difficulties we have in just the static picture, let alone the sense one might have laying on their back of shooting stars and the Milky Way and the hooting owls and the coyotes. It's not quite a psychedelic experience, but John, you and I went backpacking, and I'll take full credit for getting you back into backpacking, even I think giving you a little bit of marijuana while we were there. And you just sort of being like, wow. And so trying to describe that wow, that awe, that sense of openness is very difficult to bring to someone's normal state of mind. And it's, my father never did anything else, despite having, I had access to whatever he wanted, but he wasn't interested. He said he was happy where he was. And I think for many people, and he was a very liberal, not against drugs. He just didn't either have enough curiosity or didn't have enough discomfort where he is. And when we get to talk about death and dying, he was quite comfortable with it. My mother had died at home. My mother's mother, my grandmother died in our home. I was there. My son's a physician. My daughter moved in with him. We kept the setting very comfortable for him. And he never had a chance or an option, or he had the options and chances, but he never availed himself to do anything else other than cannabis, but that was enough. Next slide. I'll let you read this. Yeah, it's sometimes thought that, in addition to opium being quite prevalent in the late 1800s, cocaine was in Coca-Cola until 1909. So the use of psychoactive substances was quite prevalent in the earlier parts of our history. And some people say that, many of the artists may have gotten some of their artistic perceptions or their artistic translations in the use of various substances. And, the road may be very comfortable you're on. And, from a personal level, there may be no interest of anybody doing anything. And that's fine. I mean, I'm not an advocate that everybody has to do psychedelics or everybody who has a bad diagnosis should try psilocybin. In fact, that's a pretty horrible idea, even in the best held of hands. There's a colleague of mine, Dr. Tony Bosis in NYU, who has done the preeminent study on psilocybin and found that for a well-held journey, 70% of the people had one of the most significant experiences of their life, and 2/3 had dramatic reductions in their anxiety and fear of death, and lived their last months. One woman is still alive 5 years later, but with more comfort than they had, and they ascribed that specifically to their one journey on psilocybin. Tony would also say, and in conversations, that about a third of the journeys he led people on were very challenging. And that is to say, if you've lived a life where you're very transparent and you're very aware of everything that's gone on, you may have less difficult material come up, but material comes up. And one of the teachings within the psychedelic journey is that you have to be very present with somebody. It needs to be a very well held and very calm space, but stuff will still come up. The teaching for the guide or the facilitator is to encourage the person, if they see the monster, not to run away, but to dive into the monster's mouth and look out through its eyes. That there may be valuable wisdom that can be gained by understanding what are the monsters in our own brain. And that it'll be over in 4 to 6 hours. And then we can talk about it. But, okay, next slide. So, just gave a talk at the Berkeley Hillside Club about AI, so I had to keep this one in, but there are now chat bots that will serve as your psychedelic guide. I have serious considerations, or hesitations, I should say, about this. My wife is a ketamine therapist. We both feel strongly that the intuition, the human connection, and the guide are extremely important in helping anybody approach this space. And that chatbot, while it's known, may be very reflective and be able to say things like, "Oh, that sounds difficult. Tell me more." That as soon as someone gets any deeper in or says anything like, "I'm having suicidal thoughts," the chatbot quickly says, "Oh, you should call your therapist now." Because in fact, they don't deal with it. And the subtleties of connection, the linking of past events, the understanding of the intention, the indication going in, and the journey itself, taking all that and integrating it is very much a human experience. So next slide. So this is Prince Harry, who served in several tours of Iraq and talked about PTSD, quite frankly. There are a number of studies being supported by the VA now with using PTSD. Again, MDMA is not a psychedelic, but it is widely being seen as very helpful. There's a couple, Annie and Michael Mithofer, who are in the South, who have taken hundreds and hundreds of vets on MDMA journeys. We saw a lot of their videotapes as part of our training for MAPS. The ability to open and address and understand that when you saw your compatriot in the tank lose his legs and die in front of you was not your fault. Or the fact that you were the sniper and shot 2 children because you thought they were carrying a missile towards your fellows was not your fault. You may have pulled the trigger, but you're a part of a machine. You're likely a 20-year-old boy who's being placed in that environment by white older men. It's often said, war is a fight between younger men who go to war not knowing why and not hating the person they're going to kill, but they are sent by old white men who hate the old white men in the other country. And it's an interesting twist on why we go to war. But Harry talked quite frankly, and there's lots of work now about using both MDMA and psychedelics. Nolan Williams, who's at Stanford, John, you mentioned him, or you mentioned Stanford. Nolan is 42 or 4 years of age. He, about 6 years ago, had an experience with ibogaine, which is a very powerful psychedelic. It comes from the iboga root in West Africa. It is by many considered to be one of the penultimate journeys. Some people describe it as your whole life flashed in front of you in a way that you see and have every difficult experience played like it's part of a movie with judges on the other side saying, you need to look at this. You need to look at this. But I have interviewed several people who got off narcotics because of it, after trying many, many things, including methadone and modern Western medical treatment. Again, it was known that LSD got people off alcohol quite helpful. In fact, Bill, it's not talked about, but Bill of the AA fame, if you read his history, did an LSD trip to get himself off of alcohol. Next slide. So this is just the psychedelic assisted therapy on the way it affects the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal. Some of us are physicians, and so the adrenal gland, adrenergic response, if you're stuck in a hypervigilant state, it's very difficult to relax. And psychedelics can interrupt that. With the help of MDMA, you can understand it in a way that is not something that previously people haven't been able to do. Next slide. So we've also been looking not only at the chemistry, but at the fMRI studies. This is Robin Carhart Harris's work. He was at the Royal College of London, now is at UCSF, looking at the imagery of the brain during depression, which is on the left, with these deep ruts and valleys. During psilocybin, the terrain becomes flattened, and the ability to kind of see the terrain in a different way is occasioned by people. And in the post-trauma, there's still a deep chasm, but it's not quite as deep. And it's known that the longer the journey is, the longer the time you have to form new dendritic connections. So dendrinogenesis, the connection between different axons, has been demonstrated in rat models and is widely thought to be related to how you change your mind. Michael Pollan's work. Next slide. Just a quick one on personalities. This is one of my favorite slides. You have to sort of look at them. There looks at personality. We all have
number 5.
I'm sorry. Oh, okay. We all have personalities, and oftentimes a little bit of an obsessive, compulsive person is great for doctors. Add that with a little hypomania, and you're gonna get that perfect resident who's willing to work hard and keep going and stay on track. My wife works with borderline personality quite a bit. Number 5 thought to be very difficult. Here, ramming their car into the ex-lover, the orange car on the right. It's not clear that personalities and personality disorders will be something that we can help people with, but it's being investigated. Again, the rigid grooves. Next slide. And I see these more than the rest of you, but the ads for ketamine clinics. And I don't know how many people have seen them, but there's 1,600 new ketamine clinics as of last year. Ketamine is a dissociative anesthetic, widely used chemically. I discovered in the 60s, widely used in Vietnam, because high dose, it is an anesthetic. They could, very safe, does not depress respiration or blood pressure. So you could get a vet whose leg was blown off, you could give him a shot, he would still be talking to you, and you could literally amputate the leg, sew it up, and an hour or two later he'd have post-operative pain, but he wouldn't have the pain of what's going on. And it was discovered fairly recently that in a lower dose, it's a psychedelic, and in an even lower dose, it's a psycholytic. So it can be used to remove people from their material, but still allow them to have introspection. And that's the way my wife is using it. Many of the clinics are just doing it as an IV drip. It's been approved for treatment-resistant depression. That's a bit of a sham. Anesthesiologists are making a lot of money, and that's another story. Next slide. So this is going into control. And so the red, maybe where a lot of the MAGA Republicans live. People want to stay safe and in control. The blue is a little of the fear zone. You have to try something new. We're a pretty educated group. We travel, we experience new things. You're here listening to this, but we venture there. We're in the yellow zone right now. We're learning. We're maybe getting some new skills. We're taking on challenges. You're thinking, oh, maybe I'll try this. And of course, the green is really the psychedelic role of living your dreams, finding your purpose, and really connecting into your goals. Next slide. This is a book by Rachel Harris, interviewing 10 women who've been deep guides for many, many years about the psychedelic underground, trying to tell the story from their perspective. I have a list of books that you could read, but this one is a very approachable one. Next slide. And people may have read, Roland Griffins was a pioneer in psilocybin studies. He was not a user of them until his last year of life. He died 3 weeks ago of metastatic colon cancer, which was diagnosed less than 2 years ago. This is a portrait done by Alex Gray, a very famous psychedelic artist. He's holding the molecule of psilocybin, and around the outside of his self-portrait, and in fact in the stars in the background, are references to some of the effects of joy, unity, and awe, ecstasy, transcendence of time and space, numinous, ineffable spiritual experiences. Next slide. Now, this is just a little more of the fMRI studies about your brain on, niacin and your brain on psilocybin. And again, hard to explain the rush of ideas and, what some people say, like, I smelled purple, or I felt orange. The synesthesias of the way that the brain is not scrambled, but altered in a way that allows for a new understanding of existence. Next slide. This is some of the pathways. Again, the complexity of which the brain and its 100 billion neurons with each 1,000 connections, using 7 or 8 different chemicals to, GABA, DOPA, epi, oxytocin, just incredibly complex and nothing we can go into. And in fact, I don't think it's something that needs to actually be gone into to really understand the effects of psychedelics. Next slide. So psychedelics is being experimented on wellness. Famously, the Silicon Valley people are doing microdosing. There's also talk about, cannabis has been used by musicians and artists for decades, and it's now being investigated for wellness. Next slide. So this is my framework of the journey in. So that central journey in is what's called set and setting. And I've created a whole framework using inwards for going in. The first 3 are before you get there. Your interest, the potential indications. We like to put a pathological diagnosis and call it treatment-resistant depression before the FDA will allow us to even consider it. But what's your intention? And many people feel that the intention might be to connect with your younger self, connect with your future self, connect with your parents, connect with the difficult emotions you've had. But all of that leads into the journey, during which the guide on both sides there can intrude, intervene, be invested, help you go inward, help you get in alignment, help you be in integrity. And all of that comes out in the integration where the personal change happens. That's really where the work is. And most serious psychedelic therapists are doing, the Roland Griffin's Tony Bosa studies did, 4 to 6 hours of preparation, a journey of 6 to 8 hours, and then integration sessions, oftentimes extending for 6 months after a single journey. Next slide. Again, this is my wife and I, Christine, in Glacier Point. We had to hike up to the road was closed, but then we hiked into that basin behind us, which is the Merced Canyon. Okay, and then just to close out a little bit, I have a few slides on psychedelics and dying. Next slide. So this is the intro to psychedelics and dying. Next slide. So this is Neo and the Matrix. And fear is what drives a lot of medicine. The oncologists, if you haven't been to one, oh, you have to get your port put in tomorrow. You have to get your chemotherapy started Monday morning. There is very little time given to the consideration of the human experience. And to me, this slide bespeaks that driver that the medical, pharmaceutical, industrial complex plays off of. We will spend hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars on chemotherapy, and yet we hold back on what is now known to be one of the most efficacious treatments for people facing end of life. Next slide. I'll just let that one speak a little for itself. Next slide. Just coming back to Judy Chicago. And, we just had a big retreat. I invited 23 of my favorite clinicians and physicians from across the country 10 days ago. And we had a weekend with some clergy and talking about how in a wisdom council, we feel that these substances could be offered. And one of them might be at the time of initial diagnosis. If I had my druthers, when somebody got a metastatic pancreatic, metastatic lung, or metastatic brain diagnosis, they would immediately be given a week option. Probably cost $20,000, $30,000 to have the therapist and have the drugs, but to really think about what they want to do. Because if anybody read Atul Gawande's Being Mortal, they know the facts that, in fact, treating lung cancer in stage 4 kills people faster. Homer, you could probably speak to that. And there's immunotherapy and new therapies, but in general, if I get metastatic lung cancer, my mom got metastatic pancreatic cancer. She said, take me home, and she never went back to the hospital. And having watched people who go the other way, I'm not getting a Whipple, and I am going gently into the night. Next slide. So this is a bit about, people ask me, aren't you worried? What about, people getting psychotic and jumping out of buildings, or pilots crashing planes? Well, we had 2 previous plane crashes. One is thought to have been a suicide by a pilot. Nobody talked about the fact that he didn't get psilocybin as a possible treatment. What we hear is a sensationalism of this one pilot did psilocybin and tried to crash the plane. To me, this is a white man in a pharmaceutical industrial complex that is scared of a substance that costs $10 and requires $1,000 or $5,000 of well-held therapy. Does not make $100,000 for chemotherapy for any pharmaceutical company. This is what Walgreens had to pay San Francisco for narcotics and the overdose epidemic that's causing. That number, $230 million, is about half the entire funding for all of the research on psychedelics for the last 20 years. There has been a total ban on research in what is, in my humble opinion, one of the most efficacious treatments for angst, anxiety, and end of life. A couple more slides. Next slide, John. This is a billboard in San Francisco. And everybody's talking about AI is gonna be the latest and greatest. In fact, I think we don't need to go to AI. We have treatments specifically in psychedelics that might well be of more benefit. It does require the human. And here they even allude to the fact that the service, the human, will be what is really needed. One quick last slide, and this is a nod to Buddhism, kind of a complex slide about birth, rebirth, death. The central circle is the samsara, is the existence of humans in the human or in the hell realms or in the God realms. There's a wonderful book called In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, which talks about the addict who's not happy where he is, and that addiction is a desperate seeking to get out of where we are, oftentimes because of the psychological hell we've been put in. It's oftentimes driven by the hindbrain. Those of us who are more educated use our forebrain to sort of control those urges. But psychedelics, dreaming, and meditation are the three glimpses out of that human existence. And in the Buddhist realm, are used as meditation specifically. Jung used dreams, but as a glimpse into death. Christianity and Judaism talk a lot about the messianic endpoint. Buddhism has that cycle back and rebirth. And one more slide or two more slides. This is just that psychedelic vortex. You know, I have a Jewish background. This has the hexagonal frame in the middle, which is the basis of the Mogen David, the Star of David. And then the last slide is my son in the slot canyons of Arizona, Utah mostly. And Josh is 36, family physician. And I certainly hope that by the time he's my age, we'll have opened the door much more widely to allow people the opportunity to have thought about psychedelics, perhaps engaged in them, and that those have been helpful for some people, maybe only 10% of people, but for some people, so that we can go more quietly into the night, less plastic, less ICU, and be happier while we're doing it. And that's.
Thank you, David. Boy, that was quite a tour. I think Aiko has something to say for both of us.
Not for both of us. Whoa.
Yeah, because I can't do it with two computers in the same room. But David, is marijuana the only one out of all the drugs that you talked about that is legal or does not require a prescription? I'm sorry. Does not
require. Yeah, ketamine is legal. It's always been legal. It does require a prescription, and at this point there's a debate about what's called the overground, which is legal in the underground. But currently, all of the classic psychedelics, LSD, psilocybin, are still Schedule 1, which means you can't get them except in experimental. That is likely changing in the next 1 to 2 years. But yeah, psychedelics, marijuana is the only, widely available substance. I mentioned tobacco and alcohol, which are the number 1 and 2 killers on the planet. But cannabis, yes, Eiko, you're totally correct. And ketamine is still a small player because it is prescription only. And while ketamine injections or even a ketamine troche are only a few dollars, the reformulation by the pharmaceutical company to make it a nasal spray, which is the only indicated treatment for treatment-resistant depression, is about $700. So I'll leave it to you to weigh in as to why that $700 treatment got approved, whereby the oral was not. Good question. Thank you, Eiko.
So just a comment where your son is standing is Deer, I think it's Deer Canyon, and it's south of Page, and I'm sorry, Antelope Canyon. I think it's south of Page, and it's on the Navajo reservation where Aiko and I were for a couple of years. So it was very inspiring indeed to go back there. It wasn't open, or it wasn't publicly known. The Navajos probably knew about it for millennia. No, it would have been for centuries because they were newcomers to the area, relatively 500 years. And it's quite something. And so natural beauty, and I am just going to focus my screen up high. That's Half Dome. And I think we saw some pictures of Half Dome. I've been entranced by it ever since David took me to Snow Creek, and you camp right opposite Half Dome, just staring right at the face. So natural beauty. There were a couple of big things. Yeah, Shigeko.
Does Dr. Pepper ever foresee the use of psychedelics in hospice care?
I hope so. The retreat we just had was with a number of palliative care physicians and family doctors. And some people feel it's like a little too late. People probably know the average length of stay in hospice in this country is measured in days to weeks. It's considered a failure of Western medicine. It is not, that's not the optimal use. Taking somebody who at the very end of their rope and giving them, when they weigh nothing, they're stuck in their bed, and we're like, oh, we don't have anything to give you. Go try that hospice or that palliative care doctor is too little too late. In my humble opinion, again, it should be something that maybe is done like the Elysium Mysteries when you turn 60 or 70, or at least at the time of a severe diagnosis. Because my guess is if we were to offer a true well-held psychedelic journey for, let's say we took 1,000 people who all got diagnosed with lung cancer, and we took 500, we randomized them, and then 500 were given could be ketamine or could be psilocybin, and the other 500 were given IV Benadryl, something that occasions a little bit of altered mental status. And then we were to hold that space about what they really want and what they really valued. My guess would be a larger percent of the people who had a truly mystical psychedelic experience would say, let me be. I want to go to God. I want to go to Jesus. I want to go to Muhammad. I want to go be with Moses. I don't want to die in the hospital. I don't want to be chemoized, radio, and I don't want to speak for the other physicians, but most of the other physicians I talked to, and John, you and I have talked about this, we've seen too much of the ICU death. We've seen too much of the piecemeal last few months of people's lives to want much of it. So does that answer your question, Shigeko?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Good question.
Heiko, did you have your hand up?
Yeah. Yeah. Another question, David. We're all different sizes, body weights, body types, etc. So who determines what the titer is for each person? Is it an FDA controlled thing, or is it a doctor determined thing, or what is it?
Yeah, good question. I mean, currently it's all in research protocols, the above ground, and it's usually done in a dose of milligrams per kilogram. So for psilocin, which is the active ingredient of psilocybin, so they've taken the mushrooms and they have extracted out the chemical. So what costs $10 now costs $700 because it's pharmaceutical grade. They can give you a much more exacting dose. That's pretty doable within plant medicine. Anybody who's ever measured out tea knows that there's a reasonable range with you which you want to make tea from. But currently the research studies that are being done are 100 milligrams of MDMA or 0.6 milligrams per kilogram of psilocybin, or sorry, of psilocin. So they are pharmaceutical grade, standard milligram per kilogram doses. The psychological holding is a much more wide ranging unknown, because Just as, you go to 2 different doctors and they have a different bedside manner, or they offer a treatment in a way that is, I could tell you, you need to have this chemo. Or I could say, well, you could have chemo, but, and if I have an incentive that I make money off of the chemo, well, guess which one I'm going to be more likely to offer. So that's a little bit of a roundabout. It's a good question. Thank you for the prompt to go widely. And did I answer your question directly there? Yeah. And cannabis now, just to speak about cannabis, when we were younger, you go get a joint, and, who knows? Somebody tells you it's from Mexico or it's Acapulco Gold or this, and, you take a couple hits and, that's enough. Or you wait a little bit, and you have another one. The general teaching is start low, go slow. So if you're using something like psilocybin, you might want to start with a quarter dose. Or if you're doing cannabis, is now you can go get, exact doses when you walk in. If somebody hasn't walked into the dispensary, I highly recommend it. The dispensary, Bruce, I see that grin and nod, but there's one down here on Telegraph and 46th. It is like walking into the fanciest liquor store you've seen. They have, 200 kinds of buds, gummies and tinctures, and it's all legal. You have to show your license, and you can get a very exacting dose there. If anybody's trying this, I would start whatever they say the dose is. Start at a quarter of it, or maybe half of it, because especially as somebody who's over 60, you're more than likely to have a more generous effect. And you can always go higher, but having a bad kind of a dysphoric trip or dysphoric reaction is not where we want to start people.
Okay, other questions for David? Well, David, thank you very much. That was a great tour de force. So I learned a lot.
Thanks. I'll share with other people. Feel free to share, and good luck. And if people want more specific advice, they can find me through John.
Yeah, and we'll have you back for a Q&A right here. So save.
Well, we'll have to do the in-person for samples.
Yeah, that's
all right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, John.
Thank you. That was great. Thank you so much.
Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
Well, some conversation.